Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event hosted by Hill Dickinson in association with the London Stock Exchange, Agronomics and Women on Boards. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I've been asked to address. So please note that your microphones are muted and cameras are automatically switched off. If you are having any problems with sound or any other technical issues, please do try, first of all, logging off and rejoining, checking your device settings, ensuring you have disconnected any monitors connecting your computer or laptop, and checking your settings for your sound to ensure that they are set to the correct playback device. This session is being recorded and this will be shared with you once it has been edited. If you have got any questions for the speakers or for the Hill Dickinson team, please feel free to submit these via the chat box. So welcome. I am Tanya Gass from Women on Boards, and I am delighted to have been invited to support and chair this event on behalf of Hill Dickinson. As you know, this event has been moved to a virtual session due to a variety of circumstances, and we're all really disappointed that we are not meeting you in person, but I think this is still going to be a fantastic and insightful event. And I know Hill Dickinson are hoping to organise a face-to-face event in the future as a follow-up. I would like to take a moment to mention the sad passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She embodied some of the best aspects of British society and provided a sense of stability throughout her reign. Her influence was manifold, but relevant to today's event included raising awareness of the physical environment, agricultural practices and poverty issues, topics that our new king is similarly passionate about. May she rest in peace. So before I introduce you to today's speakers, let me introduce myself and Women on Boards. I'm here representing Women on Boards UK, but my particular role at Women on Boards is as the non-executive director recruitment lead. I head up the bespoke NED search team, as well as spreading the word about our organisation and purpose. I'm also a corporate governance expert, legal trainer, and in my previous career, I was a corporate finance solicitor at Clifford Chance and Gouldens. For those of you who perhaps haven't come across Women on Boards before, hopefully not too many of you, we support our 10,000 members into the boardroom. And we do this through our member support and events, by partnering with major corporates, and also through connecting boards looking for non-executive directors with our talented members. And we're 10 years old this year. We measure our success by our members' successes. On average, 8 of our members secure a new board role each week, but our wider impact and influence in relation to the board diversity agenda is also significant, and we are regularly featured in the media, and we also have a significant social media presence. We also publish research, including for the past 2 years, our Hidden Truth report, highlighting the lack of diversity on boards and in senior leadership teams in the FTSE small cap. It is our mission to change this picture. We work with 35 major corporations currently through our Next Gen Directors programmes. And we work directly with their diverse talent. We offer practical career management strategies to help them reach their full potential. In my team, we provide a bespoke NED search service, matching recruiting boards' NED needs with members who meet the requisite skills and attributes. And we either do this on a sole agency basis or we partner with headhunters to add members to their long lists. There are various ways you can support our mission to improve board diversity. If you're currently advertising or working for a board looking for a non-executive director, please do consider a different approach to recruitment and get in touch with me. And you have my contact details on this slide. So on to the main event, an introduction to cellular agriculture and the investment opportunity. Hill Dickinson are our kind hosts, and I know they are often at the forefront with their support for companies in new growth markets. This event is also being sponsored by the London Stock Exchange and Agronomics. We're going to hear from these sponsors about the investment opportunity that the agricultural revolution presents and raising capital on AIM, as well as from the Good Food Institute, the Coller Foundation, and several companies in the cellular agriculture sector. As I mentioned earlier, please do feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time, and the speakers will endeavour to answer as many of these as possible at the end of each presentation. Michael Corcoran from Hill Dickinson, who many of you will know, will be presenting those questions to each speaker. If the panel is unable to answer your question today, Hill Dickinson will follow up with a response after the webinar. So our first speaker this evening doesn't need a lengthy introduction from me. Marcus Stuttard is head of AIM, London Stock Exchange's international growth market for small and medium-sized enterprises, and has responsibility for primary markets in the UK across both AIM and the main market. Marcus is a regular speaker on growth and business funding issues and sits on a number of industry and policy advisory bodies, playing a leading role in key policy changes. Marcus, over to you.
Tanya, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So I was going to start this session just talking more broadly about the capital raising environment for growth sectors more generally. Clearly, the market conditions globally are challenging at the moment, and there are a number of global headwinds. However, I think it's important just to set that against sort of the context of last year. So from our perspective last year, market conditions were very supportive. We saw nearly £17 billion raised in London across AIM and the main markets via 126 IPOs. And I think the great thing about that was there was an equal split between AIM and the main market, with 60 IPOs on the main market, 66 on AIM, which was the highest level of transactions since 2014. And between them, those companies raised nearly £17 billion. I think, though, what is really important to think about is the capital markets, and particularly London, not just as a source of IPOs, but as a long-term source of capital. And I think for growth companies, that is particularly relevant. So last year, in addition to that £16.9 billion, we saw in total 50 billion raised. So a further 33 billion pounds raised by companies through further issues. And that was a continuation of the story we saw in 2020. And so, since the onset of the pandemic, over 110 billion pounds has been raised. So, the capital markets really do provide a long-term source of finance. This year, globally, transactions have been a little bit more subdued. Markets have been subdued. And that's obviously a result of a number of factors, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has created the supply chain issues that we all know about, higher inflation and interest rates going up. That said, in the first half of this year, we had £10 billion raised in London, and that currently stands at nearly £12 billion. And so, we've already had 31 IPOs in London, 10 of which have been on AIM. So, there is still a very robust level of activity. If we look at London compared to other European markets, just to provide a bit of a benchmark, we've seen nearly twice as many transactions in London than the nearest European competitor. And again, I think if you look on the bar chart on the left of this slide, you can see that the follow-on capital that's been raised by companies already on market remains very strong. So, again, this theme of the capital markets not just being an IPO venue, but a really genuinely long-term source of capital. If we then just dig into a little bit more detail, when I think about growth companies in my role as head of AIM, I often think about AIM as a growth market. And I was talking earlier about London's general position versus other European markets. Last year, if you took all of the capital raised across all European growth markets, 52% of that was raised on AIM alone. And AIM, being our growth market, does support companies from low tens of millions right the way through to multiple billions of pounds. Currently we have 830 companies on AIM with a total valuation of nearly 110 billion pounds. I think the really important thing about AIM is that it's never been a single sector market. We've always had a very broad church of companies represented, and if we look at the flow of IPOs over recent years and last year in particular, we saw that diversity both in terms of the sectors represented, but also I was very pleased about the fact that last year, of the companies that raised capital through AIM, either at IPO or through further issues, that wasn't dominated by a particular size of companies. We saw an increase in the number of large companies coming through to AIM, with 3 of our largest recent IPOs taking place last year, but also we saw an increased number of sort of sub £25 million companies coming to market at the point of IPO. And that's in part because some of you will be aware that there are a number of very tax efficient ways of investing into both private companies and those quoted on AIM. So things like the venture capital trust structure, which applies to AIM, really helps to cornerstone, support and underpin some of the smaller companies that come through to AIM. We're very keen at London Stock Exchange not to sort of rest on our laurels, and so work very closely with the UK government, with the FCA. And many of you will be aware that there is a very broad range of regulatory reforms taking place. And I'm very conscious that there are a lot of words on this slide, and it's possibly not the easiest to read. But I think the takeaway really from this slide is that the whole reform agenda is focused on a few core principles. One of those is very much to make it easier for private companies to transition to become public, whether that's on AIM or the main market. The other area is to make the London capital markets more founder friendly. So we've seen innovations like the extension of dual class shares on the main market. We've seen the free float requirement, so the amount of shares that need to be available to essentially public investors drop from 25% to 10%. These changes make it more easy for founders, make the markets more founder friendly, but also we're seeing as part of the package of reforms a real drive to make it easier for individual retail investors to participate in the capital markets. I think one of the things that I hear sort of regularly is sort of comparisons between Europe and the US capital markets, and often between London and New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. And I think the important thing for growth companies is that we regularly see more sub £250 million market cap IPOs in London than we do on North American exchanges, whether that's the US or Canada. And also we see better aftermarket performance, and so you can see plus 33% for micro cap IPOs in the UK compared to underperformance in the US. And that's really because the ecosystem that is built up around AIM and the smaller end of the main market is really there. It's designed to support growth companies. We have investors that really understand smaller companies and a broad range of advisors, the banks, the nominated advisors, the brokers, the financial PR firms, etc. So, coming to London, you get a really supportive environment. Just moving on now quickly to a little bit closer to the topic of this session today. We see strong growth in both the green economy, but also in the whole sort of future of food area. And so a number of statistics here that a number of you will be aware of, including the growth in the number of people who are now on plant-based diets, and also the much lower carbon footprint of plant-based foods compared to meat-based foods. And this is clearly an industry that is growing very rapidly, and therefore an industry that investors want access to. And we'll be hearing more from Agronomics later on, but just to highlight them as a key player from an AIM perspective. And so look forward to hearing Anthony speak later. I think just finally, and to wrap up before I take any questions, to our mind, the whole green economy area is one that is of vital importance to us. So we've made a number of innovations as an exchange, including the launch of our green economy mark, which highlights companies that have more than 50% of their revenues that come from green economy activities. And they're equally split between AIM and the main market, and we see the performance of those companies generally be higher than non-green economy companies, which I think that statistic aligned with the bar chart on this slide showing the growth in assets under management that are aligned with the green economy show the importance of the green economy as a sector, and the continued growth that we expect to see. I will leave it here. I don't expect people to read the legal disclaimer, but I'm very happy, Tanya, to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Marcus. This is an opportunity for you to ask any questions you may have. So, Michael, do we have any questions already to pose to Marcus?
We've just got one. Thank you. So, Marcus, thank you. That was very interesting and very informative. I've got a question that says, this is an industry that so far has attracted a lot of VC finance, private equity, and very few of the companies in the cell agriculture space or alternative protein space have listed. Some obviously have. What would you say are a couple or one of the key benefits of listing vis-a-vis at this relatively early stage in a company's life cycle compared to potentially taking money from private equity or VC?
So thanks, Michael. That's a really good point. I've obviously talked quite a lot about the overall themes, but not really talked about the benefits of an IPO. And I think whilst we haven't had that many specifically from the sector, what I can say with real conviction is that we are having an increased number of conversations from companies from the sector. So I do expect the pipeline to grow actually quite quickly as market conditions continue to improve. And the sorts of reasons that companies that we're talking to are citing are quite standard reasons about, actually, I think a lot of companies find that their credibility and their profile are not just
It's Michael Corcoran. Has Marcus
just with investing. That will be a very. Sorry, Michael. Can you hear me?
I think we lost you for a little bit there, or I did. I'm not sure if everyone else did. Apologies. We don't necessarily know that. I unfortunately lost you for a little bit, but I think we got the thrust of what you were saying. So thank you very much.
Michael, I don't know whether you've lost connection or whether I have, but maybe if I hand back to Tanya.
Hello. Yes, I think we probably all lost you at that point, Marcus, for a little bit. And I can't currently take back control. So, Diane, if you could help sort that out from Marcus's side.
I've taken back control, Tanya, so can you take it from me?
Nope. Fortunately not.
Maybe if you just take down the slides and
Yes.
reshare, but Tanya, if you want to kind of carry on.
Yes, I'm back.
But
I'm
Marcus
back.
has just
Okay.
joined, so I think you should be okay.
Okay, so thank you, Marcus. Sorry for that. There's inevitable problems, aren't there, with these sessions? But I think we are back on track. So next we have Saren from the Good Food Institute. Saren's background is originally in biochemistry with a focus on cellular senescence and the fundamental processes underlying human aging. Over the last few years, she has been involved in both the cultivated meat space, focusing on cell culture media, and then co-founding Cellular Agriculture UK, and also external innovation more generally, previously working at InPart, a startup that connects R&D focused companies with academia to encourage greater collaboration. Saren's now at Good Food Institute Europe and works to build a strong, well-funded scientific community in the sustainable protein space across Europe. So thank you, Saren, for joining us.
Thank you, Tanya, for that introduction, and thanks to all of those involved in organising the event today as well. So I'm, well, firstly starting with the Good Food Institute and introducing who we are. So briefly myself, I'm Saren. I'm a Science and Technology Manager at the Good Food Institute Europe. The Good Food Institute more broadly is an international NGO that works to develop the roadmap for a more sustainable, secure and just protein system. In terms of how we do that, we have 3 core programmatic areas. So science and technology, really trying to push forward the science behind alternative proteins. Corporate engagement, that's working with the different players across the full length of the value chain, from startups and investors through to food companies, ingredient suppliers, distribution channels. And then finally, we have a policy team who works to really ensure that there's an enabling policy environment and that there's a fair and transparent path to market for these products. And as mentioned, we're an international NGO, so we're entirely funded by philanthropy. Okay, so I think I don't need to dwell too long on the whys of alternative proteins. I think they're probably quite familiar to most people, but just to give the kind of super high level refresher, essentially the question that I think we're all striving to answer here is how it is that we're going to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050. So right now, I believe every year we're producing 350 million megatons of meat. In the year 2050, that'll look more like 500. And as it stands, alternative proteins are barely a rounding error on that number. But with that being true, I think we're all quite familiar now with the various reasons why it's not sustainable to actually be producing that quantity of animal protein and gaining our meat derived from animals. And that's from an environmental perspective, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but if you just look at that in isolation, somewhere between 15 and 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture. That's the same as from all transportation globally. If we look at food security and efficiency, we simply don't have enough land to actually produce our protein through animals. Even if we look at chicken, this example on the center of the slide, which is the most efficient animal we have for converting food into protein, it still takes 9 calories of feed to a chicken to produce a calorie of meat. So if we scale up our existing production systems, we can't actually reach those numbers of how much protein we're going to need. And then finally, there are some public health concerns around antimicrobial resistance and also zoonotic diseases. None of this is new. These are just a choice selection of headlines about kind of essentially emphasizing this and showing we know this already and we've known this for quite a long time. But actually, if you look at global meat production and the projections for how much we're expecting to have over the coming decades, as you can see, it's just going up and up, and it really seems to track in a linear fashion with global development and increasing middle classes, so to speak. So it really doesn't look like it's set to change, despite everything we know about how it simply can't provide all of the solution over the next few decades. And then if we look at kind of why that might be, why it is that meat consumption continues to track and kind of rise in this way, it seems to be that it's because the primary drivers of actual consumer decision making really aren't these greater concerns around health, environmental impact, and animal welfare. Those are often secondary concerns. But first and foremost, for the vast majority of consumers, what actually matters is taste and price and convenience. And that really informs the kind of theory of change behind what we're trying to do at the Good Food Institute. We don't believe that we can solve this problem by telling people what to eat or telling them to reduce their meat consumption. What we have to do is provide a genuinely scalable, market-driven approach that gives an alternative so that people can actually continue to consume the same meat and dairy, but with that meat and dairy being made in a far more sustainable way. So it really matters that these alternatives compete on taste, price, and convenience, and then the market will actually, through its own mechanisms, drive the uptake and make sure that we can displace some of these harms from animal agriculture. I've spoken a bit about the kind of, well, exactly what I just said, the harms of animal agriculture. So just to briefly overview how alternative proteins actually check out on those terms. This slide just gives a very brief overview of the environmental impacts of plant-based meat, cultivated meat, and then conventional animals, so chicken, pork, and beef. As you can see, essentially any metric that you choose to look at, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, air pollution, or the various chemicals that are involved, there are significantly fewer impacts associated with alternative proteins. And it's really not surprising as a system which is inherently utilizes yet less land, because you're not feeding food to animals to then harvest a small fraction of that biomass for consumption. You're just going to have a much smaller environmental footprint overall. Just to kind of give an indication of where the industry's actually looked over the last few years, as you can see, there's been a really big uptake in the amount of venture capital flowing into the alternative proteins industry. If you look at any one year, the amount of investments that's gone into that space is almost the same as the accumulation of all prior years added up together. So it really is exponential. And what's kind of optimistic about that, or gives us reasons to be hopeful, is that there is still kind of real kind of excitement for this movement, whilst we're seeing that the products today aren't yet competing on those metrics that I mentioned really matter. So taste, price, and convenience. So there really is cause for optimism that we are having as much consumer uptake as we have. It is worth saying though, if we just look at a comparison of the amount of funding that's gone to this space, even though it's increased on relative terms a lot over the last few years, it really isn't enough when you look at how much funding is needed to enter the space to actually finance the infrastructure which will be necessary to scale up these industries. And yeah, this graph essentially just gives a comparison. On the left-hand side here, we have the contribution of animal agriculture to global greenhouse gas emissions compared with transportation. As you can see, it's very similar. But if you look at the invested capital that's gone into the alternatives for these industries, electric transportation has received much more investment relative to alternative proteins. So there's a bit of a gap here that needs to be addressed. Okay. I just want to give a very brief kind of high-level introduction about what alternative proteins actually are. Today, we're talking about cellular agriculture, which essentially encompasses fermentation and cultivated and can be seen as distinct from plant-based. But just to give a brief overview of all of them so that everyone can be anchored and make sure we're all kind of on the same page of what we're talking about. Plant-based is essentially meat alternatives which use plants as the building block. So think of your Beyond Burger, your Impossible Burger. We're starting with things like soy and pea and wheat. We're breaking them down to their constituent components and then reformulating them into products which actually replicate meat products. Fermentation is essentially using microorganisms, so that could be fungi, it could be yeast, it could be algae, in kind of weird and wonderful ways to produce protein directly, or to produce ingredients which expand our ability to kind of innovate with alternative proteins. And then finally, cultivated is essentially growing animal cells outside of an animal and creating real meat that's identical to meat, but in an environment that is essentially decoupled from the harms of having to grow animals in intensive conditions. A brief overview of how cultivated meat works, because I think this is probably the one that's most new to people. As just described, essentially you're taking cells from an animal, you were growing them up in a cultivator. You could essentially imagine this being like a big beer brewery, or how we produce yogurt, for example. These cells are growing in this cultivator, and then we kind of provide them with the food that they need to grow. And then through a change in their conditions, they start to actually specialize into the cell types that meat is constructed of. So fat and muscle particularly. To ground us again in terms of where we're at with this industry, essentially up to 2013, there were sporadic research projects happening at universities around the world. And then over the last few years, we've really seen it start to become a kind of real prestigious scientific field in its own right. And if you look at where we are now, around 2022, we're seeing the first companies starting to operate at demonstration scale. Precision fermentation, which is the other category kind of within this broader cellular agriculture bucket. So this is kind of using microorganisms to produce ingredients. I just wanted to give a spotlight on some companies that we've seen in the space which are doing really exciting things here. So just to kind of point out a couple of these, to see every company which is using microorganisms to produce real egg white proteins, which can then be used as an animal ingredient replacement. Likewise, the Impossible Burger is expressing heme, which is a molecule that we normally find in animal muscles, but they're expressing that in a yeast, and they can integrate that into their plant-based burger. And this next slide, and I think my final slide, essentially really demonstrates this point that although I've presented alternative proteins as being these distinct product categories, in reality, they're actually very likely to occur along a spectrum where there will be synergistic benefits between fermentation, plant-based and cultivated. So I just gave that example of the Impossible Burger, where it's a plant-based burger, but they're using heme from fermentation. Likewise, we're seeing different companies exploring using plant-based ingredients, but including cultivated fat to really give that mouthfeel and experience of consuming animal meat. And then finally, just to say that at the Good Food Institute, if you go to our website and search Advancing Solutions in Alternative Proteins, we've mapped out what the biggest priorities, and that's kind of technical and also commercial ecosystem priorities that really are kind of the most highly leveraged bottlenecks for the alternative protein industry. And these are the areas where we'd be most excited to see more innovation in this space. And yeah, as mentioned, you can check out our website, and we have various different newsletters as well. And I will leave it there for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and you covered an awful lot in 10 minutes, so well done. And I think I'm probably speak for some of the audience in that that's a great explanation for those of us who don't really understand the alternative protein landscape. So thank you. Michael, did we have any questions for Sarah?
Yes, we've had three. I'm going to be selfish and ask mine if I can first. I may as well take the power and use it. Speaking specifically about the UK, we've seen in Singapore and probably not many other jurisdictions, products actually reaching the shelves, or certainly in restaurants, people, consumers being able to try them. When do you think you will see the first non-plant alternative protein products on the shelves in the UK or in restaurants for consumers to try? And then I've got one, I'll do one of the other two after this very quickly.
Sure. So I think we don't actually have a solid answer on that for the UK. It really depends on how the regulation is going to be mapped out by the Food Standards Agency over the coming years. What we know is that once a company does submit an actual product to go through the approval process, that will probably take between 1 to 2 years. And to our knowledge, that hasn't been done yet. So we're at least 1 to 2 years away. But it's also a question outside of regulation. It's a question about scaling up and the ability to actually reach manufacturing capacity. And that's a kind of funding dependent question as well.
Thank you. And then the second question from Andrea Cataruzza is, there was an earlier table in your presentation that showed the environmental impact of cultivated meat wasn't so good. I think he said ×8. I can't remember, but he said, can you elaborate?
Yeah, so the data on, so I guess the first thing I'd say is the data when compared with conventional animal agriculture is still significantly better. So if you take cultivated meat and compare it with conventional beef, that's 92% fewer greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. what really matters with cultivated meat and what the kind of value is here, I suppose, is that because we're no longer relying on animals, because we're essentially taking the cells and growing them in industrial conditions in these cultivators, we are effectively electrifying the process of creating meat. And so one of the biggest kind of determinants of the environmental impact at that point is your energy source. But that's kind of something that essentially we have to be addressing anyway. If you're able to use renewable energy in the process, then those costs come significantly down.
Thank you. There are some other questions, but I will deal with them after the event. And just somebody has asked about the slides, and certainly we will try to make there'll be a recording of this webinar available and distributed on social media, but certainly available to anyone who wants it afterwards, including the slides. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah, again. So next we have Anthony. And obviously, Seren has explained the sector, and Anthony now from Agronomics is here to explain the investment opportunity that this agricultural revolution presents. So Anthony is a co-founder of Agronomics and previously worked at Burnbrae Group, investing in early stage investment opportunities for over 13 years. He is a board member or observer of a number of early stage companies in biopharma and the field of cellular agriculture, including on Ego, Formo, Solar Foods and Mutable. So Anthony, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me. Look, my name is Anthony Chow. As you know, I'm a co-founder of Agronomics, which is a London-listed, AIM-listed investment company focused exclusively on this field of cellular agriculture. We launched in 2019. We were at that point in time, we were marketing a £2 million cash shell, but clearly we've had some success being listed on AIM, as we now have a market cap of about £150 million, along with cash reserves of £40 million, and have a roster of institutional investors, including the likes of BlackRock, Canaccord, and a number of other household names. We are the single largest dedicated investor in this field. It is relatively early, but also rapidly advancing. And we have built a portfolio of 24 companies, all of which have technologies with the potential to create a step change in the efficiency of production of many of those animal products that Seren has just mentioned. Economic opportunity aside, we believe that this is one of the largest ESG opportunities of the coming decades. And it has implications clearly for greenhouse gas emissions, the health of our oceans, animal welfare, human health, and even has a role to play in the reduction in risk of pandemics into the future. And one of our overarching theses, which is absolutely in line with the Good Food Institute, is that it is very difficult to change consumer behavior in the short term. So we are applying biotechnology to produce those same products which consumers have been used to consuming, but just looking to produce those much more efficiently. The Good Food Institute is one of the key proponents of all alternative proteins, but we do not focus on the plant-based alternatives. We decided to focus on precision fermentation, cell culture, and the enabling technologies for both of those because of the intellectual property positions of these companies. From an investment standpoint, we believe that these companies are much more attractive when it comes to long-term investment returns, because the plant-based products, their values are typically driven by the company values are driven by their branding and their ability to distribute these products, whereas cell ag products need to be developed by interdisciplinary teams, stem cell biologists, strain engineers, bioprocess engineers, and so forth. And these companies end up spending tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, in developing these cell lines and bacteria and fungi strains, single-celled organisms, getting to them, like hopefully to the point where they will produce protein so efficiently that it will be cheaper than conventional production methods. So one of the things that is particularly notable about cellular agriculture is that it is still very much an emerging field. I have done so many presentations now, and it is really striking how significant the lack of awareness is around this technology. But then again, the industry is actually quite new. 2013 was when the first proof of concept burger was produced. Cost 250,000 euros. Professor Mark Post at Maastricht University did that one. But it took him 3 years to spin out that research project into the first commercial endeavor in what is now a company called Mosa Meats. Today, that company claims that it can produce a beef patty at a price point of around 9 euros. So you can see how quickly progress is occurring here. Moving on, it's now the case that you can walk into Starbucks in the US in a pilot program and get milk in your coffee that's produced using precision fermentation. That company, Perfect Day, has those products on the market. And similarly, the Every company also has products which are commercially available. In terms of the meat products, one of the questions of the audience was around the UK and the likelihood that they're going to approve products. Look, we certainly hope that this is going to happen soon. Agronomics is a founding member of something called the Alternative Protein Association, which is seeking to help educate the government on how big an opportunity this is from a food security standpoint, as well as a job creation standpoint. But it is going to require legislative change, so we're talking years, not months. But the really exciting inflection point that we believe is coming for cell culture is really in the US, where we know for a fact that 2 companies in the field have formally submitted their dossiers to the FDA and the USDA. So we're feeling pretty confident that someone is going to get a product approval. And I note that in December 2020, when Eat Just got its first approval in Singapore, that Agronomics share price was up 20 to 30% on the day. That company is not in our portfolio, but it was in sympathy to that very exciting news, because it made people realize that these products are not decades away at all. They are really here and now. And there are some forecasts out there that, particularly from A.T. Kearney, which indicate that approximately 35% of the meat market, which by 2040 is going to be a $1.8 trillion market, will be produced using these technologies. I'm not going to go through all of these sector highlights, but needless to say that the announcements and the excitement in this industry is shifting away from advances in science and very much towards product approvals, now having a number of products on the precision fermentation side approved in the US. Australia also recently approved the heme protein for the Impossible Burger. And then there are a number of other commercial partnerships which are being formed between some of the most advanced companies in the field of cellular agriculture, as well as the largest companies in the world, such as Nestle. Watch this space, but certainly the big catalyst from an investment standpoint is going to be the approval of a product in the US, and keeping in mind that the US as a single market is large enough to sustain this entire industry in reality for more than a decade. Such is the volume of animal protein which is consumed by Americans. Agronomics is, as I said, the only way that you can gain concentrated exposure to this field in the public or private markets. There are other food tech funds out there, but all have a very heavy weighting towards the plant-based opportunities, which again, in our view, are a little bit less exciting. In terms of our portfolio, the construction here was very deliberate. We have focused in on major protein categories. Beef, pork, and chicken account for approximately 25% of total animal protein consumption. So if you don't have exposure to them, you're missing out on the $1 trillion market opportunities. But then below that, you have luxury leather goods. Our company Vitro Labs just signed a commercial supply agreement with Kering. But then the exposure extends into dairy, which is an $800 billion market opportunity, and eggs, which is about half that. So these are absolutely massive markets that are soon to be disrupted. I realize that I'm running out of time. So I just want to highlight one company which ties in nicely again to what Sarah from the Good Food Institute mentioned. We have only made one investment in the picks and shovels or the infrastructure that is going to support this industry as it moves towards massive scale. Precision fermentation companies in our field are making very rapid progress on their strain engineering and development of their products, but at the moment there simply isn't the large scale precision fermentation production capacity out there. Liberation Labs was formed exclusively to address this. Its first facility is going to be 600,000 litres in capacity, will cost about $75 million. It will be somewhere in the Midwest where you have access to cheap power, cheap labour, and cheap sugar, because each of those, or collectively, those represent approximately 75% of the operating costs of a facility like that. So if I could just end on telling you that, and reiterating that this is the largest ESG opportunity of the next couple of decades. If we don't fix the food system, we're going to cause irreparable damage to the natural environment. And this is the beginning of a multi-decade, multi-trillion-dollar run of capital entering this sector, which I suspect the London Stock Exchange is going to have a role in bringing into the sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. A lot of information in there. Has anyone got any questions? Michael.
Yes, sorry. Tying in with what you finished on there, Anthony, actually, and also what Marcus said earlier, at this stage, because venture capital PE funding's been available for a lot of these companies, we haven't seen in the UK or particularly anywhere many of them go public. You've obviously got 20 plus companies in your portfolio. Is that something that you see in 2023 as something they're discussing and you can see happening? Don't name any companies, obviously.
Look, of course, yeah, the private markets as well as the public markets are not so kind at the moment. These companies do require lots of money. We estimate that approximately $300 million is going to be required by individual companies to get products approved, particularly on the cell culture side. So they're capital hungry. Look, there are only a handful of examples of relatively small companies that have gone public in this sector. I'm not sure that they've been massive successes, but that is, that is because they're early. But by the time these companies are ready to go public, which isn't going to be that far off, they should be pretty well poised for revenues and really about scaling up their processes to address or meet the demand for their products.
The only place you can buy it currently is really by investing in Agronomics.
That's it.
Very good. Thank you, Anthony.
Yes.
So, Anthony, did you have anything as well to say about this slide? That was your final slide.
Oh, look, I mean, this just gives you an indication of the precision fermentation capacity which is out there. And Liberation Labs is at the top right corner trying to build this out. And we think that in about 2.5 years, we'll have that first 600,000 litre facility up and running. But just to note that the remaining capacity out there is either utilised or was not built exclusively for food production. It was typically for pharmaceuticals. So it's not quite fit for the purpose of food production.
Right, thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so we've had some questions there for Anthony. Obviously, if you have any further questions, do keep putting them into the chat box. Up next, we have Pasi Vainika. Now, Dr. Vainika is the CEO and co-founder of Solar Foods, a food tech company that develops innovations for global food production. Before Solar Foods, he led a strategic initiative called Neo Carbon Energy, the single largest renewable energy research project in Finland. Pasi is also the Mission Innovation Champion for Finland. I like that title, working with 24 countries and the European Commission to accelerate global clean energy innovation. Pasi.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Yeah, having energy research background, there is something specific before going to describing what solar food does worth mentioning for the food sector. So today, about 1/3 of the global emissions are due to what we eat. But quite interestingly, having energy research background, there are very ambitious targets to reduce that 70% of emissions according to Paris Climate Accord. So these numbers should be the other way around after 2 decades. So suddenly we realize that actually most of the environmental impact and greenhouse gas emissions are due to what we eat during my lifetime. So this just more pronounced the importance of what we are doing here. So Solar Foods has a quite specific take on how to produce protein ingredients for the future. And we say that we disconnect food production from agriculture completely due to a reason that I explain in the next few minutes. What we are doing is we have collected environmental samples. So basically, we went out to the wild to revisit what is it that the environment and the planet offers to us, and search for specific organisms, single cells, and found our first one, a quite specific one, that we are growing now through a technology called gas fermentation. So basically, we are just letting this organism continue life in a fermenter and plan that to be a food ingredient for the food industry. So more specifically, what we do, there's the gas fermenter there in the middle in this chart. So the organism is there with its trillions of friends. What is specific for the technology is that this organism, it's not photosynthetic. So for the energy, it does not use sunlight, neither it eats sugar. That is typically the case of fermentation, which means that sugar is, of course, an agricultural product and that you feed for the organism. What we are doing is we are feeding this organism with carbon dioxide and hydrogen that we make with electricity by splitting water. And hydrogen is the source of energy instead of sugars and sunlight, and carbon dioxide is a source of carbon, as it is for the plants. And of course, we need about 5% of the dry mass of the cells in our product are nutrients. Those nutrients plants typically take through roots. So that is the important detail in the growth media there that we need to have. But with these quite simple primary inputs, the organism is able to use those just to grow and multiply. And then we let the process run and separate the cells from the process, and you end up with a powder like this that is nutritionally somewhere between dried meat, dried soy, and dried carrot. Dried carrot because of beta carotene that gives a distinct color for the organism. When we do this, providing that the electricity what we use is made without burning fossil fuels, in other words, wind, solar, or nuclear, and hydro as well. If that is the case, then disconnecting from agriculture means that all the environmental benefits basically fall on your lap, because most of the environmental impacts in food production are, in a way or another, due to land use. What we are now doing is we have this amazing powder produced with this very strange technology. We have proven that it works as a food ingredient, so that it forms structure. For example, yogurt-like structure that forms the thickness of a yogurt makes the difference from water to actual food. So this kind of thickness structure for ice cream application is something what we've been doing. So ingredient, so powder and technology functional ingredient, and finally the consumer will have a real dish and through food. So basically, there's a new ingredient that appear in a food system, but also disappear in food. So all these foods what you see here have been made using our ingredient that we have given the name of Solein. Meat alternatives, snacks, beverages of different kinds, cereal, bakery, pasta, also noodle, very interesting application, spreads, soft cheeses, ice cream, and so on. We have submitted regulatory for regulatory approval in the European Union already a year ago. So we did also for the UK. But these tend to be quite lengthy processes, so it takes about another year to actually be finished with that process. Meanwhile, we are building our production capacity. We are building what we call Factory 01. You could call that a demonstrator plant close to Helsinki Airport, 8 minutes by train anti-clockwise. There it is on the map. It looks like this on the site today. Those poles are 8 meters, but they actually are going to be twice as tall, to 16, close to 20 meters. It will produce about 100 ton per year of this ingredient. Also, there is going to be a kind of Apple Store of food, so everyone is invited to come to visit us, see the production, taste production, maybe buy also a t-shirt if you like. The value prop, this is the usual stuff where startups have maybe one there in the middle, which is security of supply is more pronounced these days. So when you disconnect from the use of fertile land, that's why the name of Solar Foods, you can literally go in the middle of the desert to produce food, and that can bring some specific features on how people see this technology. So rather producing one ingredient now, we see this as a platform technology. We are scaling up, but it's interesting to mention here at the end that we are also scaling down. We are part of a NASA promoted project for what they call Deep Space Food Challenge, to develop concepts for food production during Mars missions. So with some luck, we will get to build one of these devices that we've designed for this purpose, to build one of these one day. Let's see what the next year will bring to us. Here's our roadmap. I will not go into detail, but I'm happy to share the slides later on in the case you wish. But I mean, going to the regulatory production building production capacity, the tandem that Anthony referred to earlier, is something where we are deep in now, and hope to surface from there in the course of next year. Thank you very much.
Oh, you took me by surprise there, Pasi. I can see on your roadmap, obviously, you are dependent upon approvals and obviously there's building of the factory, but I suppose I'm intrigued to know, when will we be tasting the first foods, do you think, from this new ingredient?
Yeah, it depends on the country. We've also we've said it publicly that we've also submitted for Singapore. That the data is the same for everyone. It's just the difference in the processing time. It's not light to get an approval in Singapore, but it's just a quite efficient machine how to deal with these agreements, and it's an excellent dialogue. So that could be my first guess, if it would be something little launch there. Let's see. Also, we've submitted working on the US grass, but it will be something very little, maybe through a restaurant in the course of next year, because we don't have the production volumes. So that would then rather go to 2024 in Europe.
So have we got any questions from the audience, Michael?
No, there was a question around products, but I think Pasi has answered it there with your question, Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pasi. Really fascinating, and you know, all of these conversations make you start thinking about what you've got planned for dinner, and you should switch to something else. Okay, so thank you. So our next speaker is Alex from the Clean Food Group, and Alex Neves is a successful entrepreneur with 13 years of experience in fast-moving consumer goods, specifically food and beverages. In 2009, he co-founded the UK-based chilled food business, Scratch Meals Limited. In 2018, he joined the management team at EMAC Life Sciences, which then sold to Curaleaf last year for $400 million. Alex has now co-founded Clean Food Group with the aim of growing a leading cultivated food ingredients business, starting with a cultivated alternative to palm oil. Actually, a product I'm personally very interested in, Alex. I want to hear about this as we eat a lot of peanut butter and crisps in our house. So over to you to tell us about this and what you're up to at Clean Food Group.
Thanks very much, Tanya, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex, co-founder and CEO of the Clean Food Group. Yep, for those of you that don't know us, we're a UK-based food tech business aiming to market healthier, more sustainable alternatives to food ingredients that are damaging our health and the health of our planet. And as Alex said, we're starting with a resource that's the world's most useful, but also one of the most harmful. And that resource.
Your microphone isn't the best and your camera's not on, which isn't a problem. But if you can move your microphone, it might be rubbing against something.
I'm sorry about that.
Oh, there you are.
It seems to be on my system.
It is now, yes, and you sound better. Great, thanks.
That's strange. Maybe there was a delay or something. So sorry about that. I'll start again. Well, the resource is palm oil, but I guess why palm oil? You know, most people I speak to don't really know much about palm oil. They know it's a controversial ingredient. They know that it's bad for the environment, but they don't know the extent to which it's used within food products or products in general. So I thought we could maybe at the beginning just step away from the facts and figures briefly and try and make this a bit real. So I wanted you to think about the types of products you use on a daily basis. So today, for instance, you probably brushed your teeth in the morning. You may have washed your hair or used shower gel. After that, you may have had a shave or put moisturizer on, or you may have put on some makeup, some eyeliner or some lipstick. At breakfast, you might have gone for some cereal or a pastry or some toast, or you might have on that toast you might have spread some margarine or a chocolate spread or peanut butter. And later on in the morning, after hard days or a hard morning's work, you might have had a well-earned tea break with some biscuits or a chocolate bar. I think you're starting to get the gist. You know, I haven't even got to lunch yet. Palm oil has literally become ingrained. It's a permanent feature in our lives and in our daily routines. And to put this in perspective, this is how much we use on a daily basis. So 20 mil on average, and most of us without even knowing it. The global discourse around climate change tends to focus around fossil fuels and our reliance on oil and gas. But problems stem from every corner of our lives, and as Pasi mentioned in his presentation last, up to around 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from our food systems. And those food systems are lubricated by oils. So did you know, for example, that after rice and wheat, vegetable oils are the most consumed food in the world. In fact, they make up about 20% of our daily calorie intake. And palm oil is the most consumed vegetable oil. And why is that? Well, really, it's because its versatility is its superpower. It can be both liquid and semi-solid at room temperature. It is a silky texture, making it excellent for creating that luxurious consistency in cosmetics and personal care products. It's that goo in that gooey chocolate spread that you put on your toast this morning, and it makes the toast more consistent, stable, and fresh tasting. It's got a high melting point, perfect for giving fried products that craveable, crispy, sort of crunchy texture. And it adds texture and moistness to cakes, pastries, and cookies. It's resistant to oxidation, which means it can help give products a longer shelf life. And to food developers, it's literally a hero ingredient that create craveable products that keep consumers coming back and time again. And as a result, it's present in over 50% of all the products we use. And it crosses food, cosmetics, toiletries, hair care, cleaning, industrial and biofuels products. And the palm oil industry produces 75 million tonnes of it a year to service these industries. So I hope that I'm beginning to demonstrate the scale of our reliance on palm oil. It quite literally keeps us and our economies moving. And yet it comes at a massive environmental cost that can't be ignored. It's one of the largest drivers of deforestation. So on the one hand, we have a crucially important, versatile and useful natural resource. And on the other, we're literally killing our rainforests to keep up with demand. In Southeast Asia alone, palm oil producers slash and burn the equivalent of 300 football pitches every hour. The impact is horrific, and not just for our emission levels, but also for the orangutans and many other endangered species that lose their habitat every day as it's destroyed. And I guess, you know, one solution would be, of course, to plant palm oil trees across all farmland across the world. But unfortunately, it's only able to grow in a very, very thin and concentrated band across tropical rainforests around the equator, affecting some of the world's most precious biodiverse land, known as our world's greatest carbon sinks, or planet Earth's lungs. And meanwhile, demand continues to grow. Our projected global population growth of 10 billion by 2050 and other increasing demands from the food industry and others mean that palm oil demand is forecast by BASF to increase by up to 6 times to between 264 and 447 million tonnes per year. But the issue is that there simply isn't the capacity to meet this increase, meaning producers will have to slash and burn deeper and deeper into the rainforest, into that thin band. And on top of this, right now, international edible oil markets are in turmoil due to the war in Ukraine, and the unprecedented effects of climate change ruining crops are adding to the food insecurity crisis, putting further and further pressure on the palm oil supply chain. But change is coming, of course, and on the screen here, you'll see that at COP26, nations agreed on reversing and ending deforestation by 2030, which, if you think about it, coupled with increasing demand, will have an inevitable effect on the market price over the coming years. Environmentally speaking, this is obviously a welcome start, but arguably not enough to stem the daily damage to our ecosystems. So we need a solution. Well, I'm not the first to point this out. In fact, in 2018, the UK supermarket Iceland released an advert that got the world talking. It was narrated by Emma Thompson and saw Iceland pledge to eradicate palm oil from all their products. But earlier this year, as a result of the war in Ukraine and the squeeze on the supply chains, they were temporarily forced to reintroduce it. And they're not the only business to have difficulty eradicating it. Many others have too. So what's the solution? Well, our solution is not to eradicate it, but to replace it. Our natural, bioequivalent, non-GMO palm oil alternative, developed over 8 years at the University of Bath by Professor Chris Chuck, is designed as a drop-in solution. A solution that is made from fermentation, not deforestation. It can sit on our shelves and in our showers with the same versatility, functionality, fatty acid profile, with no change to finished product formulations, no change for consumers, and no negative impact on the planet. We can provide it in solid or liquid or derivative form, exactly as it is found in the current market. So the process starts with waste or industrial side streams. And using fermentation, we grow a proprietary yeast in a fermenter and then extract the oil as well as other valuable co-products, which then go into further processing. By using industrial waste or industrial side streams, we're creating value at both ends of the value chain. And it's a local solution, reducing food miles and removing the current need for complex and fragile global logistics. We're providing a way for FMCGs and retailers to use their own waste to create their own oil substitutes. And for others, we'll simply supply them the oil. Right now, we're producing at pilot scale, kilos of oil per week. But we're currently planning a large-scale pilot plant or demonstration plant that will produce tons per week for completion at the end of next year. And at the same time, we started the regulatory work to bring our oils to the market in foods as well as other categories, with the view to launching our clean palm oil onto the market in a couple of years once we've had approval for them. And in the meantime, we're working on other commercial collaborations that we'll be announcing shortly. So, in conclusion, I hope I've explained that there's a problem with palm oil, but there's also a solution. One that does not require any change or from a product developer or consumer level, and one that offers an opportunity outside of the constraints of traditional agriculture. So I think just to wrap up, I'd like to leave you with one final thought on the market opportunity. For innovators like us looking to disrupt the palm oil industry, just 0.25% of the forecast increase in demand over the next 30 years is in itself a multi-billion opportunity. But in our view, microbial oils such as ours will make up at least 20% of the forecast increase by 2030. And it's our aim to lead that industry as it grows. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a really compelling argument for replacing palm oil. Thank you, Alex. So do we have any questions, Michael?
Yes, just one. You mentioned in the presentation that obviously vegetable oils are also a huge issue. Does the process transfer to other oils, or is it just a palm oil process? Do you see yourself producing other oils in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So the tech platform developed by Chris at the University of Bath is actually a remarkably versatile platform and can produce oils all the way along the spectrum from unsaturated all the way through to saturated oils like palm. And so, yeah, it's very much within our pipeline to, after having brought out palm as our first product, to then move into other oils.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any others, or was that it for Alex?
That's it for Alex. Trying to stay on time as well, Tanya.
I know we're doing brilliantly. Okay, thank you so much. So our last speaker this afternoon is Stephanie Hashton, and she's going to talk about the all-important regulatory aspects of alternative proteins. Stephanie is a policy officer at the Jeremy Coller Foundation, a philanthropic and strategic grant-making organisation with two primary focus areas of venture and management education, and also animal welfare and human health issues caused by intensive animal agriculture. Since joining the Foundation's policy team, she has led on work streams for alternative protein development and understanding the political risks and opportunities, as well as in policy discussions around the need for a just transition to the agricultural sector. So thanks, Stephanie, for joining us. Over to you.
Hi, and thank you so much, Tanya, for the introduction. So, hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Hashton, policy officer at the Jeremy Coller Foundation. I also work very closely with the FAIR Initiative, which is an investor network, which focuses on the risks and opportunities for investors in agriculture. So firstly, I have got a slide here just on what I will be tackling today, which is looking at regulation. So I'll provide a brief overview and then talk about the challenges when it comes to labeling and also opportunities when it comes to the development of frameworks and investments. So I'd like to start by kind of reiterating what many of the other panelists have already touched upon this evening, and that is that investment into alternatives and plant-based proteins are increasingly being recognized as a really important pathway in addressing some of society's most pressing problems. So this includes climate change, biodiversity loss, antibiotic use and antimicrobial resistance as a result, but also looking at food security and food sovereignty. This is a really fast growing sector with investments in the space increasing year on year. Seren from GFI also kind of touched on the kind of exponential growth of investments in this space. And as you may know already, BCG recently reported that plant-based proteins offer by far the best climate investment out of all sectors in terms of emissions reductions per dollar invested. But as for the question around how are regulations for plant-based proteins and cultivated meat developing, well, what we can see is that there are some challenges and some opportunities. So I'm going to elaborate on this, and I'll look specifically at labeling restrictions around plant-based proteins, but also opportunities for novel food approvals in different countries. So let's start with the challenges. So over recent months, what alternative protein companies have found themselves in is a kind of growing number of challenges when it comes to the labeling of their products. This is not a new challenge, but it has heated up over the recent months. So kind of in the past, terms like meaty, dairy, sausage, burger, these have all been terms that have been used predominantly by the animal protein sector. And the meat industry is beginning to push back on plant-based proteins using what they kind of consider to be their terminology. So this is a big argument that's being used by the meat industry, and especially when it comes to their arguments around consumer confusion. So do consumers really understand that the meat-free sausage doesn't contain any meat? But as you can see from this slide, I've pulled out some of the kind of studies, the growing number of studies that are showing that consumers usually are not confused, or what we can see is that they're not confused. So yeah, as I said, this is a discussion that's been around for a long time, looking at labeling laws, and it's been around in Europe for a while because in the EU, labeling laws around the terms milk, yogurt, and cheese for plant-based products have been banned since 2017. But in more recent months, we've seen this reigniting. So there have been updates in South Africa, in France, and in Turkey, and I'm just going to touch upon these now quickly. So at the beginning of this summer, this year, the French government tried to ban the use of meat terms like steak and burger, and this would have come into effect from next month. The proposed ban was actually suspended in the end by the highest French court, but the future of labeling for alternative proteins is still unclear in France. This similarly went down in South Africa, where a recent ban actually went further. So not only was it trying to ban the labeling of plant-based products using kind of meat terminology like biltong, for example, it also wanted to remove those products that didn't comply from the shelves of supermarkets. But the plant-based sector pushed back and appealed against this. So seizures and bans have actually been put on hold until November this year, which is when we should expect another update. But worst of all, in a kind of much more extreme example, we saw that Turkey recently banned the sale and production of all plant-based cheese. And this really leaves vegan and lactose intolerant consumers with no options. So the labeling law debate is happening globally, and each country will be looking to the precedents that are set in other countries. So while protecting consumers is important, it's also important to recognize that this debate over labeling laws could be stifling the choice of consumers who are not confused by plant-based labels. But to move on to the opportunity, and to realize the economic benefits of alternative proteins, there needs to be further investment into the development of more safe, sustainable, and nutritional product options, as well as making it a lot simpler for alternative protein companies to know what do they need to do to get their product to the market. And this is where regulation comes in. So the projections on this slide kind of just show and some suggestions on the increasing growth of consumer demand for alternative protein. And this just really highlights how important it is for the regulation and framework developments to kind of keep up with this growing consumer demand. But submitting a novel food application varies per country, which has also been touched upon during this panel discussion. And we've also seen that cell-based or cultivated meat is an emerging area for this sector. So as you may know, and has already been touched on, cultivated meat has so far only been approved for public sale in Singapore. That Singapore has developed the clearest guidance on novel food regulation and with very specific requirements for fermentation and cell cultured products. But if we move to the UK, who were actually pioneers back in 2013, where they allowed a private tasting of a cultivated meat burger, the UK is actually being hampered by the existing EU approval process. Since leaving the EU, the Food Standards Agency of the UK has committed to reviewing this guidance material to help companies navigate the regulations. But in the EU, if we move back to the EU, the kind of minimal number of novel food approvals and applications made to date is likely down to their processes. A novel food application, for example, can take up to 28 months. But if we look at the US, novel food approvals are much quicker, and they take around a third of the time as Europe, averaging around 10 months. So this could explain the kind of greater number of approval for alternative proteins there. But this is, this is a space that we're seeing a lot of developments, and, countries are committing to developing clearer alternative protein regulations. So this year we saw China commit to alternative protein research and development in their 5-year agriculture plan. We saw South Korea stating that they aim to establish a regulatory framework by the end of this year. And also Japan has kind of launched a team of experts to analyze the safety of cultivated meat. And this is a real first step in developing a path to the market. But ultimately, government investment in this sector is crucial to kind of driving alternative proteins forward. So we've looked, so from the FAIR side, the Investor Network, they're actually publishing a paper soon looking at government investments in this sector. And it suggests or shows that Canada, the US and Singapore are all countries that are highly invested in the plant-based sector. Denmark and the Netherlands also, showing very strong examples there. They've increased investments, but also the Netherlands this year approved cultivated meat for private tastings this year. And then in the UK, the recent government food strategy has pledged £120 million in research funding for food. But although there's no direct commitment to alternative protein research, some of this funding could go towards alternative proteins. So I know I'm coming to the end of my time. So just to kind of summarize, there's a few developments in this space, and the challenge is that the plant-based sector is facing on labeling is really important and definitely something to keep an eye on. But investments in both financial terms and in research and development of frameworks and application process, these have seen a lot of progress. So this is an important step for regulation, and governments really do have this critical role to play, whether or not that's supportive. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. I hope this was a helpful overview.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Very helpful. Any questions for Stephanie, Michael?
Yes, one good one, hopefully, Stephanie, and apologies if you can't answer it, it's so good. Somebody has asked, similar to governments doing their best or trying to introduce regulations to reduce use of petrol and diesel cars, can you see, is there a government, is there a country that is currently contemplating measures to actually force people to eat less meat and drive them towards alternatives? I know we've seen on the news the recent Netherlands protests and similar, but regulations along that line will cause real controversy if people are told to eat less meat and people regulate to make that happen.
Absolutely. Telling people to eat less meat is certainly a contentious political issue. I think if we're looking at the reduction in consumption, I think that does also relate to reduction in production. So you're right, the Netherlands is a key example of where a reduction in livestock numbers it has been committed. So the reasoning behind the Netherlands reducing their livestock numbers is to do with the level of nitrogen pollution. So in the Netherlands, I think there's over 100 million livestock in that are being produced. The Netherlands is a massive meat exporter, so it has the nitrogen pollution is so bad that they've had to commit to reducing their livestock numbers quite significantly. But also the Dutch government, interestingly, back in 2020, published a national protein strategy, and it advised people to actually consume more plant-based foods. But the Netherlands actually isn't the only country I'd point to in answer to this question, because actually Ireland is another country that, although isn't directly linking to reducing meat production or meat consumption, they have committed legally, like a legally binding commitment to reducing agriculture emissions by 25%. But this will undoubtedly impact meat production and potentially consumption as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting developments in this space as well. I hope that answers your question, Michael.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to say, with less production, presumably higher prices, and it pushes the tipping point when these products are cost competitive closer.
I think you're right. With reduction in production, it will ultimately impact the price of meat. But this is also very much linked to the work I also do on the just transition, because obviously you don't want to price people out and only benefit some sections of society. You also need to be very careful when discussing this with the farming community and those workers that are involved in the agriculture sector, because simply reducing livestock numbers without a contingency plan of how do you transition those farmers has huge implications. So it's also part of this conversation.
I'm glad I'm not in charge.
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of stakeholders in these shifts, aren't there?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
And thank you to all our speakers this evening, and many thanks for all your really interesting, useful questions. I hope you found the content of this session useful. For my part, I'm quite heartened to hear about the innovation taking place to address our planet's biggest challenge. I often listen to boards discussing ESG strategy, and today we've heard not just talk but significant action. Before we end, please do note that Hill Dickinson have shared a link in the chat box to a feedback survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to complete this short form. Also, if you are interested in hearing more from Hill Dickinson on this topic in the form of events, networking or thought leadership, you will be able to sign up for these opportunities once you have completed the feedback survey. And you will also be receiving a follow-up email from Hill Dickinson, which will include links to add or update your marketing preferences. And of course, very importantly, you'll also receive a link to the recording of today's session. There's a little bit more information about Hill Dickinson. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found it useful and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Great job.